Hey, I am back today to talk about Slavoj Žižek's First as Farce, Then as Tragedy, which is, in my mind, a pretty good introduction to what Žižek is all about. And what I mean by that is that it's not too heavy in the psychoanalytic and Marxist theory that could be quite alienating, that is, if you don't have a firm grasp of it already. So it's a fairly good introduction. Now, before jumping into that, if you're new here, hey, I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts in a somewhat accessible way to save you from having to necessarily read them if you don't have the time, or to help you understand it if you're trying to get through it. Now, with that being said, I am by no means the be-all, end-all expert in this stuff, so take anything I say with a grain of salt, and the best thing to do would be to actually read the book. Now, if you're new here, like, share, subscribe. That would help me out a lot. If you aren't new here, like, share, subscribe. That would help me out a lot. If you want to follow me, you can do that on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy to see mostly pictures of my cats. If you want to help me out monetarily, you can do that via Patreon. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you can find it in podcast form on pretty much anywhere you get podcasts where there shouldn't be any ads. And if you're listening to this in a podcast form, you can check it out on YouTube, where sometimes I do videos if you're interested in that. So don't waste any more of your time with that stuff. Let's talk about Žižek. So this title, First as Farce, Then as Tragedy, comes from Karl Marx's recounting Hegel's claim that all events occur twice. First to kind of as a tragedy, and then as a farce. That is, when something happens, it's bad, but if it happens again, there's a joking component to it. That is, it's funny. So as for the book itself, it's very aphoristic. Now, what aphoristic means is that it's kind of disjointed. It doesn't follow a kind of clear narrative, and Žižek is almost from paragraph to paragraph discussing new things in relation to the broad problem that is, how do we confront globalized capitalism, or capitalism at all, today. So with that being said, it makes it somewhat difficult to present this book, because I can't just present everything that Žižek goes into, because that would take too long, and I may as well just be reading it out to you. So my approach instead will be to kind of give you the broad strokes of what's going on here with my own criticisms of Žižek, which I should point out at first, because I know I'm going to annoy some people. I'm going to be very hard on Žižek here. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I know that this text is not quintessential Žižek, and that he goes in a lot more detail in a lot of his other texts. But with that being said, he makes some claims here that need to be addressed head on. And no better place to start than the introduction titled The Lessons of the First Decade. So setting the tone here, he dissuades any reactionaries from reading this book, because it's it's a pretty anti-capitalist book, and if someone wants to take from this any sort of defense of capitalism, they will be sorely disappointed. But the kind of event that Žižek is imagining this book through is the fallout, or 9/11 and its fallout. Specifically, he's thinking about the kind of situation we find ourselves in following 9/11, where there is this effort to kind of reclaim an idea about American exceptionalism, which dovetails with ideas about liberty, while at the same time suspending those liberties, especially for brown, non-white Americans, people who are just subject to serious harms by the general public, and incarcerated for no reason, subject to arbitrary, more stringent surveillance practices, like in airports and stuff like that, that demonstrated a loss of liberties for Americans, and then how this extends to the general public with stuff like the Patriot Act, or just a general increase in surveillance and policing. So that kind of sets the tone here, but the real interest for Žižek is the 2008 financial crisis, and what that means for capitalism, and what it means for the future of humanity. So as for the title, that is First as Farce, Then as Tragedy, for Marx, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, Germany's Ancien Régime, which was the ancient regime, or the old regime, that its decay was a farcical repetition of France's tragic decay. So we call upon the past in this way as a kind of farcical way to cope with the sting of its original death. So in the case of the German old regime, it was only they who were convinced of its reality as a legitimate, unique period, even though it wasn't real. So its collapse was really a non-real thing either. So it was a kind of joke, that is, as it happened. Now looking to today, Žižek ponders the existence of people, who he calls cynics here, kind of liberal cynics, who claim not to belong to any kind of real order. They don't see any meaning in the world. And Žižek is like, no, your life has a lot of meaning, and that meaning is determined very much by ideology. And ideology is what determines you even in your capacity to say no to meaning. But what is more, this ideological framework, one that is very clearly a capitalist one, is growing ever more private and exclusive, whereas in the case of the fall of, the Berlin Wall, it was meant to be a great opening of all domains, a kind of opening of the world. What we're seeing with this kind of neoliberal turn within capitalism, or this kind of neoliberal turn that's been going on for about 40 years, is a closing off of specific zones that is becoming more and more private, despite the promise of globalized capitalism to make the world more open, to make it more accessible. Now, he says that this was kind of potentiated by 9/11, in which more secrecy emerged, more calls for privatization, which, there might be some truth to that, but this trend obviously antedates, it comes before 9/11. But the great irony in all of this is exactly how there is a claim to a kind of neoliberal humanism with this ideology that gives us this sense that we're becoming more open, when in fact there are all these borders being erected. And we can certainly see that with the rhetoric that came out of the United States government a few years ago, up till now, I guess, with the insistence on building a physical wall, for example. Now for Žižek, the solution is concerningly easy, and that is, it is a communist solution to this problem, but we're going to nuance this as we go. That is, he says, and we're still within the introduction here, that this book has a communist trajectory. Communism is the end point. So he endeavors to look at today through a communist lens, rather than diagnosing today as any different from yesterday. People might say, oh, we are in the post-modern age, or the information age, or post-industrial age, or whatever. And how these different lenses, or these different approaches, kind of frame the problem as having moved away from Marx, whereas Žižek wants to bring it back to Marx and to ask, how can we use Marx today, and what does communism mean today, and how can communism actually solve a lot of the problems that we are confronted with? And what I will say now is that Žižek treats communism as a panacea, which is a cure-all, which in fact it is not. But he is giving us this idea here, is certainly an ambitious one, but we'll see how it goes. So this demands a kind of assault against capitalism and capitalist ideology. And this isn't done for Žižek with a kind of direct conflict of people taking arms up against their capitalist overlords, but instead, in his words, it happens with patient, ideological, critical work. And that here closes off the introduction into chapter 1, titled It's Ideology, Stupid. I don't know why I messed that up. Am I even saying words anymore? What is wrong with me? So first, Žižek, or maybe I should say this. This book is divided into 2 broad chapters. The first one, It's Ideology, Stupid, discusses the problem at hand, and that is the problem with advanced capitalism. And then the second chapter explores some of the possible remedies and the historical strategies to cope with it and to challenge capitalism. So for Žižek, given the widespread concerns about the expansion of fictional money, what might also be called speculative capital, and if anyone is curious about this and want a kind of easy way to have a basic introduction to it, the film The Big Short with Steve Carell and Ryan Gosling and a bunch of dudes. Really explores this problem well. But he's concerned with this expansion of fictional capital and speculative capital. But in all of this, he was quite surprised, given its expansion, that other people were surprised about what happened in 2008, and that is the financial crash. Žižek is, he's like, how are you surprised about this? This is exactly what was going to happen. More and more money was based off of less and less reality, so to speak. It was based more and more upon speculation, upon subprime lending that wasn't ever going to be returned. It wasn't ever going to be paid back. So how could that possibly sustain itself? Which is, and I think that there might be a bit of a tendency to see this as being derivative of capitalism, as though it's a kind of bastardized form of capitalism or a kind of mutation of it, when in fact it is absolutely endemic to capitalism and to ideas about surplus value that extract more than is put into the system. As in the case of labor, there's more taken out of laborers than is put into labor. Now, that's just me, so we're dealing with the same situation here. So we are in some ways helpless to this situation. And one reason for that is its unpredictability. That is the market's unpredictability. It's very difficult to try and master it, which is kind of a tricky, slippery word to use, but it is beyond our control. And even the greatest economists don't know what the market is going to do. At best, they can project forecast how people are going to respond to the market that will have some effect on it. So if they think there's going to be some kind of recession, or if there's like an election coming up, they can predict how people are going to react. Are they going to pump more money into the stock market, which is going to see it grow? Are they going to take money out? So on and so forth. So in response to the crash, Žižek takes the perspective, or takes the stance, that we were way too quick to bail out the bankers, which is for him, obviously not a great thing, because it gives the people who committed the crimes, essentially, who were kind of more morally dubious, it gives them a carte blanche to kind of keep going at the expense of the taxpayers. So the $700 billion that was spent on the market may have been necessary. And Žižek isn't totally ignorant of the fact that it had to happen lest people were just going to die because they wouldn't be able to eat. But he's very suspicious about it, and he's very curious as to why that we live in a world in which that is something that can take place. Now, somewhat ironically, Republicans were opposed to bailing out the lenders because they believed this to be a robbery of the American people who they really thought they were standing up for or representing. So that was a big problem, in that you had the Democrats under Obama giving out this bailout to these millionaires and billionaires, and Republicans were saying that that's not a great idea, which doesn't really seem to fit within the narrative today, or how we might understand the treatment of billionaires, at least in terms of the left-right spectrum in the political sense in the United States. But even more ironically, the Republicans called it a socialist bailout, as though it was a way to just help the super rich, which is something we certainly can hear today. If anyone listens to any mass media coming out of the United States, it's that Democrats are socialists because they want to help out corporations or big tech. And it's a very confusing thing to hear, because that is the exact opposite of what socialism is. But in any case, this confuses Žižek, because he's like, well, how is that a socialist thing to do? These Democrats are not socialists, which Žižek is obviously doesn't like to hear that, because he knows what socialism is. But what is even more ironic is the fact that these are the same people, these same Republicans, who believe firmly in the idea of trickle-down economics, that by making the rich richer, that money will trickle down to help the poor. So he was even more confused as to why they were opposed to it. And then in response, there were calls by Republicans to essentially, for the United States to move back to a kind of real economy, to move away from a fictional economy, based on speculative capital back to like producing things. But given all these kind of strange beliefs and these kind of strange reversals of opinion, Žižek says that the Democrat move to bail out the big banks, to bail out the billionaires, was actually a great way to help the lower class. And that is because in the world we live in today, if the rich suffer, the poor suffer, which makes no sense, because if the poor suffer, the rich don't suffer. In fact, the rich actually benefit. So because this is the world in which we live, Žižek sort of applauds the Democrats, but we're going to criticize, like, that's not exactly what he says, to say that they had to do it because that's how messed up our world is, and which is why the Democrat solution to any kind of Republican strategy is really only a centrist move in itself, in that it doesn't actually tackle the problems at hand, the macroscopular, the macroeconomic, the macro problems that we are confronted with under advanced capitalism. And of course, one of the false monikers that we are sold about this thing called capitalism is the idea of the free market that the Republicans wanted to maintain. And they saw by giving out money to these billionaires, it would increase the deficit, it would essentially slant the playing field in favor of billionaires. Wasn't a move for the free market. It wasn't the demonstration of free market economics. And Žižek is obviously suspicious of this when he recognizes quite accurately that most of these politicians only got their position because they worked with various lobbyists, they promised various things to various rich people. And that demonstrates that, the so-called free market isn't really free at all. And it is very much helped by politicians who are going to themselves then benefit either in the form of dark money or, getting more chances for re-election or whatever. So rather than throwing the $700 billion at the situation, Žižek demanded us to sit and think, to think about it, because either case, either withholding the money or giving it as it happened, demonstrates some kind of a commitment to the system at hand rather than any kind of reform or any kind of revolution of the system, which isn't what these people were trying to do. Most of these people were just trying to respond and react to a situation that was dire, that is following 2008. And this is why so many responses, that is immediate responses to crises, can also so easily be either racist or populist. That is, they try to turn to tradition, they try to turn to what feels real in response to what is quite chaotic and what is quite unpredictable. And with this, he turns to the idea proposed by Naomi Klein that crises are good for capitalism. And it's not just Klein that says this. We find examples of this in Marx as well, where capitalism constantly potentiates the crises that will give it more strength, that will give it more kind of momentum. But the really amazing thing in all of this is that capitalism is treated as though, as I kind of already said, as something that is free. And the freedom that is associated with it then comes to take on the status of being somewhat natural. And I've heard this argument way more times than I would like. And that is that capitalism reflects human nature because it is based on competition and humans are naturally competitive. And the only real necessary kind of response to that is that capitalism is a very new invention in the course of human history. And it seems strange that if it's a natural occurrence, that it only emerged some 60,000 years after humans became what we now know to be humans. And so this gives it a kind of special status. Now jump back 30, 40 years when conversations about socialism and state socialism and communism were kind of at their peak, that is with the Soviet Union and Cuba, what we were hearing a lot was that socialism is something that can't be natural because it needs to have like state regulation and it has to be monitored. Now, we don't say that with capitalism, even following a serious financial crisis that demands essentially a parental bailout that is by the government. Instead, we say that, it's perhaps a necessary consequence. Like, this is something that has to happen. When Žižek, all he's trying to do is demonstrate that no, this is the ideological pill we have been given to believe that it is natural and to then make it transparent, because that's what ideology is. It is essentially to us what water is to a fish, what fish is to water. And then to kind of maintain this ideological illusion, which is kind of redundant thing to say, but this ideology, we consume ultra pro-capitalist things like Ayn Rand, who has a strange following even today, like a strangely strong following today, which is strange. I don't know why I'm so caught up on that. Or other kind of pro-capitalist propaganda that essentially feeds us the idea that it is the best of all possible systems. Of course, that fails to mention that the biggest economy in the world, very much coming up to what America is capable of, is communist China. At least that is if we believe what the conservatives in the United States have to say about China being a communist country. It seems like communism is a lot more effective at doing what capitalism claims to be best at. Which isn't an endorsement. I don't want to live in communist China, and nor do I think that it is a good place. But we have to recognize that if we're measuring worth, measuring value based off of one's economic capacity and the capacity to develop as a superpower, capitalism does not hold a monopoly on that position. And what also is quite amazing about this situation is just that the horrors of capitalism are very much clear to us. Like, we know what sweatshop labor is, and we know how it is the direct result of capitalism, and we know how colonization was very much motivated by the desire to extract resources for the sake of profit. We very much know how all of these things were potentiated by capital, not to mention the ecological crisis, big ag, like none of that stuff. Like, what is, in my mind, worse in terms of like the treatment of human bodies, what we are seeing is just a complete willing ignorance of those elements of it, to the point that it's almost haunting that we can continue to sell this idea, to the point that we don't even think about basic reform, like the most basic elementary things that acknowledge that there is a problem. And we are not prepared to have that conversation, lest we be called like, a communist or socialist or whatever. Or to make it a little bit more relevant, in the case of big tech that is very much in the kind of open dialogue today in the United States with Section 230, it's really quite remarkable how these same people can kind of struggle for an idea about free market capitalism, yet be opposed to that market operating in the way that it has to form these kind of tech monopolies, because that is what the free market will always tend towards, a kind of full-fledged monopoly or oligopoly that will stifle and make competition almost virtually impossible. Now, not a lot of people, I guess, or maybe everyone knows this, I don't know, but we might be seeing a severe challenge to that, at least in the United States, by China, because these companies cannot actually enter China, because China has a very profoundly impressive kind of firewall system that doesn't allow American or Western companies, that is these tech companies, to enter, but they can export their things out. And this is why there was all that fear about, TikTok being a way for China to take information from Americans. But in any case, what we are seeing is the rise of a challenge to this system at hand, which is kind of growing. It's coming. It's on the horizon. But in any case, what we are still presented with is the result of laissez-faire, of free market capitalism, which is what these Republicans should recognize. And they should acknowledge that their efforts to stifle tech growth is a communist, that's drastic. Let's say it's a socialist strategy. That is, it is the government intervening in the growth of a company. So with this growing kind of tech the big tech, we have growing militarization. What we are seeing for Žižek, and he uses Agamben, that is Giorgio Agamben's idea about the state of exception, which is when I haven't done Agamben on this channel actually, but I should. It is the idea that at a point, it is a point when laws are suspended so that military rule can kind of take over and suspend people's rights and all that. We are kind of inching towards that moment with various homo sakers who are kind of sacred humans, but they aren't sacred in that they are exalted. They are sacred in that they can be killed essentially with impunity. But anyways, that is the situation we're driving towards. And I'm sorry that I brought that up because it might have made it more confusing. But yeah, that's kind of what Agamben's on about. But in the case of like these homo sakers, these kind of sacred humans that are treated with violence, what we are seeing instead is not like them being treated with physical violence. We just have like kind of racism that is directed against the so-called other, the person that doesn't exist within this framework. So this is all meant to kind of maintain the idea that we are within a system that is benevolent, and that it is only like humans on an individual level that are operating in a negative way, instead of it being an entire ideological framework that motivates these kinds of forms of hatred, for example, which makes us lose sight of the kind of oncoming militarism, of monopolies, of big tech, of all these different emerging horrors. And he says, and I hate this, but he's like, and we can't forget that it was the communists who were most opposed to segregation, when it's like, and slavery. And it's like, no, I think black people were the most against slavery and segregation, not these white communists. But that, and to go on a little bit of a tangent, that is a problem with the way that kind of solutions are framed as being like the struggle of whiteness to fix the world's problems, the kind of white savior complex, as though the people who are being saved aren't actually people. And this comes down to the language of slavery too, where enslaved people are just considered slaves. Like, we just take out the people, and that is all they are in that moment. And in our discourse around their emancipation, what we are doing is kind of replicating the very logic of their subjugation in the form of them not even entering the conversation. So when he says that it was the communists who were most opposed to slavery, he is erasing the fact that it was the black people who were most opposed to slavery. But yeah, sorry, I digress. So then he goes on to a brief little detour through psychoanalysis, and I don't want to go into that too much because it's kind of complicated and it would just take us too far astray. But he says that essentially, with a Lacanian tone here, that we often don't mean what we say. So behind the words we say is often the true meaning, and the goal of the psychoanalyst is to kind of reveal that true meaning to some extent, or to allow the person to reveal it to themselves. So for him, we don't essentially mean what we say. So he gives the example of the way that anti-Semitic people blame like Jewish people for their economic struggles, whereas Žižek wants to say, no, it's capitalism, like not Jewish people. But the problem with this is that it fails to acknowledge that in this case, like in the case of anti-Semitism, the violence of anti-Semitism and the violence inflicted on Jewish people far predates the emergence of capitalism by millennia. And so we cannot say that these people just hate capitalism, because this hatred of Jewish people extends much deeper and extends back much further than capitalism. But in any case, you get what he's saying here. So after having sufficiently set the tone for the problems at hand, he moves now into the second chapter, the communist hypothesis, kind of laying out what he hopes to do, or what he hopes the solution will be to this problem. So the goal is for him to invigorate a communist idea, not necessarily as a progressive one, as though it's like something we'll just steadily arrive to, but one that is going to hit roadblocks enough to start from the beginning and confront all of these various crises and collisions just to kind of move itself forward ad infinitum, that is forever. And this strategy is one that also just kind of waits, lurks in the shadows for the system to malfunction, and it can then sneak in and reorganize it in that way, or at that point. So then, given the various problems that we are confronted with capitalism, be it the looming ecological crisis, if we can even say it's looming and that we aren't right in it, the friction between notions of private and intellectual property, problems of new techno-scientific developments, new forms of apartheid, we have to wonder whether or not we have to just let capitalism run its course and deal with its own antagonisms, or if it's something that should be taken head on. And I'm going to, kind of spoiler alert, Žižek doesn't give us an answer to this because he just doesn't. So we are just left with this problem here. And that this really is a problem that goes back to Marx, in that Marx and Engels were very clear that capitalism is a necessary thing, and you cannot catalyze, you cannot move it too quickly to arrive to communism. That is, you can't force communism to emerge. That would be wrong, and that would lead to dictatorships, to totalitarianism. In fact, there were a number of criteria that had to be met before communism could be achieved. One of them was you needed everyone to be literate. You needed everyone to have a profound knowledge, essentially, of science, math, whatever. You needed people to essentially move away from religion, tradition, patriarchy, to move away from anything that would give them, that would keep them tethered to the land, for example. And only once those criteria have been met could the move to communism would essentially just happen in the final movement of the workers' struggle or the workers' revolt. But these workers today, and this really reveals, or this has been taken up by a number of different people, aren't the same workers that Marx was writing about. In very many ways, the kinds of workers that we are presented with today are substanceless, and this isn't saying anything about these people at all, but it's just the way that the new kinds of labor inflict a new kind of alienation on people that is so much more different than the way that Marx had confronted them, had he himself been a part of. Not to mention the fact that workers are pretty much helpless against nuclear weapons. It's very difficult to imagine something like a communist revolution against governments that possess nuclear weapons and the kinds of military armaments that were unthinkable 200 or 150 years ago. So once we consider all of these things, it becomes a little bit tricky to imagine this move to communism. And this is why I think in part Žižek is so careful. He doesn't want to just give this solution. But what he is clear about is that he doesn't want to advocate, he's not advocating here for socialism, because socialism is just a reformist strategy that is, used by Nordic countries. And as I just watched this TikTok and I don't remember the person's name, this woman, God, and I don't want to take her stuff because it's probably her own idea, but anyways, the Nordic countries are not great, and this TikTok really explained it well. So we are moving towards, for him, communism, or should be moving towards that, and not socialism, which is just a kind of reformist attitude that will keep exploitation going. And workers, even under socialism, are going to be reduced to the same kind of substancelessness that he's describing here. And he says this to kind of poke at Michel Foucault. So if you don't know, one of Foucault's central theses is that people are controlled by being seen. They see one another. They are being seen by figures of authority that can then regulate and control their actions and the way they work, and to essentially make them more productive. Now, Žižek contrasts this with the work of Badiou to say that these workers, these substanceless proletarian workers, aren't actually visible. They are reduced to non-sight. They are almost not even existent in this world. And so, like in the case of dreams, what is unseen often reveals a lot about what we see in the day-to-day. So when we are confronted with the realities of labor, of alienation, then suddenly we get a broader picture of the situation we find ourselves in the day-to-day. And then he goes on about how, like, Obama's becoming president in 2008 wasn't really a significant thing, despite the fact that he was a black president. Or it was. He does concede that it was absolutely a significant thing, but he says that it doesn't really matter because he's just a liberal centrist who isn't actually going to do anything to bring upon communism, which is Žižek's criterion. If you are not working towards communism, you may as well, or as he calls someone toward the end of his book, you may as well be an idiot, like you're not doing anything good. Now, this is when Žižek it becomes really fun, and that is he goes to criticize, of course, political correctness, to say that white men's burden, what was historically called the white man's burden, has transformed into the white man's guilt. So the white man's burden, for those that aren't familiar, was the idea that it was the onus of white people to civilize the world and to make the world proper. Now that has transformed to him into the idea of the white man's guilt, the feeling of guilt that white people have for the actions of their ancestors, for colonization, for segregation, for racism, for residential schools. He's like, yeah, you can forget about that. Not important. We'll just move on because that's in the past. We have to be focused now on getting over these fake differences to then now focus on the fact that we are all joined under a common struggle against communism. Against capitalism. But interestingly, he's okay with it when Marx criticizes colonization for some reason. Like, that kind of guilt is okay. Because in Žižek's words, British colonization of India created the conditions for the double liberation of India from the constraints of its own tradition as well as from colonization itself. So let me just read that again. British colonization of India created the conditions for the double liberation of India, from both the constraints of its own tradition as well as from colonization itself. This is him, of course, defending colonization as being a way to liberate what I'm assuming he's saying as the kind of tradition-struck primitive ideas of India from itself into newness. Now, of course, Žižek is being an idiot, and this is not something that we can really condone because colonization is not something that's condonable, even though in a lot of these cases, these people were essentially practicing what Marx had in mind. And he gives the example of, or back in like Marx's day of I think it's the man in Jamaica that, fishes in the morning and, does nothing in the afternoon. And Marx is taking that to be the example of like the way that we should live. But what I'm suspicious about is this insistence of this move away from tradition, because it seems to me like it is less a desire to move away from tradition and more a desire to make some people move away from tradition while keeping other people in their own privileged position. Because I don't see this same defense mounted by Žižek here, at least in this book, he might have said it somewhere else, of the attacks on 9/11 as being an attack against American tradition. And it's like, oh, thank God, we've been liberated from this idea of global financial capitalism, or at least there was that effort to do that. So therefore, that was a really great thing, and we should really join in with this effort by, in that case, of course, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, to get rid of this American tradition and these traditions we cling so heavily onto. We don't hear that from Žižek. We hear it about brown people and how brown people should give up their tradition to become, I'm assuming, I don't even know what does that mean to get rid of tradition? What is left over? And this for me really colors my disdain for these kinds of efforts. In that I ask, or of which I ask, what will remain once communism has arrived? What will education look like? Are we going to learn about traditional indigenous hunting practices? Are we going to learn about Chinese medicine? Are we going to learn about, I don't know, Catholic ideas about morality? What are we going to learn? What are we going to be kind of given in hospitals? If the answer to those questions is essentially giving white answers, giving Western answers, that we are going to be essentially given or taught about, Shakespeare and Chaucer and taught about Galileo, what does that mean for the communist goal? What is it going to arrive at? Is it going to be a radical egalitarianism, or is it just going to be a replication of the very systems we are currently entrenched in? So there's little wonder then why Marx and Marxism has been criticized as being Eurocentric, because it just seems like this end result is just going to reflect Western values or European values. But I digress. Moving from there, Žižek then takes aim at illegal immigrants trying to gain status, where he's like, what that's doing is essentially only entering people into the kind of bureaucratic regime of citizenship, which is just meant to kind of control people and to keep tabs on people. When for most of these people, it's a matter of surviving or making some kind of livelihood for their children. And it seems weird for someone with a great deal of prestige and status to deny people that, or to criticize it as being not a real revolutionary move because they're, just trying to feed their families. But because they're not working for the communist goal, then they are doing something wrong. Now, to be more generous to Žižek, because I just don't like this book, he recognizes that part of the goal will be, of course, to upend white centrism, to destabilize the monopoly that white Europeans have on the production of knowledge, I guess, or in their capacity to monopolize on power. But that, of course, begs a certain question. Well, how much of this communist struggle is going to be kind of colored by these now, as he just laid it out, these kind of racial tensions as well that antedate capitalism itself? So it seems to me like then he's presenting a new problem, and that is the problem between like white superiority that very much comes before capitalism. But that is, in any case, we can't ask him because you just have the book here. So essentially moving on, and I'm sure I've annoyed enough people, he lays out the goal, just as Marx does, for a kind of overturning of this idea of the state that we currently have, and that is the idea of the state working in favor of capital. So the state is a kind of character in the capitalist play that keeps it going. Now, what Marx does is he overturns that and says that the state will actually become a state run by the dictatorship of the proletarian. So that'll essentially mean that there won't be oppression for Marx because the proletarian make up 99.9% of the population. So what we will see is this kind of democratic move where everyone will be equal in that overturning, leaving only a few to be at the bottom, but they will then be reintegrated back in. But unlike in Marx's day, Žižek recognizes that the state isn't quite as static, it isn't quite as still as it once was. In fact, it's always moving, it's changing, it's developing, it's mutating, just alongside capitalism that is always mutating and changing as well. So in order to kind of resist it, we have to kind of accommodate these changes and adapt to them as well. But we have to do this with a certain proximity to it. So in his words, to resist by withdrawing to a position of distance from the state is false. Like, we can't just take ourselves out of it, and that would be wrong, just as he thinks that we can't get outside ideology, despite, claims that, it's just about getting outside outside of ideology, which essentially explains as well his animosity for democracy, because democracy only reflects the kind of dominant ideological framework. It doesn't actually represent truth, so to speak. And so under this order, whereas democracy would demand differences in opinion, what we are seeing is instead a kind of ironing out of differences in favor of a kind of homogenized playing field. And part of this, he says, was the result of this 1968 students' movement and kind of resistive movements of the time, in which there emerged a kind of more effective capitalism, not a challenge against it. So while there may have been a move from traditional labor and traditional education and the traditional family to things like, oh, let's dissolve the differences between like managers and workers, or, you know, let's make teachers and students like friends with one another. And what we saw then was just a more a smoother operating capitalist system that gave the semblance of liberation. It gave the semblance of equality. So with all that being said, hegemony doesn't work in the same way, like either since that time or since way before, since Marx's time. And so it demands new strategies that are prepared to take on new different forms and to confront, as we said earlier, these various possible crises that they will hurt a lot, but they will be necessary. So he gives us an image here. He's like, communism is not the light at the end of the tunnel. That light that we're seeing is actually another train coming right at us that's going to collide with us and then screw everything up. And our job is to recognize the inevitability of this crash. And it's certainly looming. Like another financial crash is just around the corner. There's no denying it. Maybe COVID slowed it down because there's less lending, I assume. Maybe. I don't know. Less people can pay. I have no idea. I'm not an economist, but we know that this next crash is coming and that we must be prepared for it. And then he ends the book by saying that he turns to Deleuze and how Deleuze, when Deleuze died, he was working on a book about Marx. And Žižek uses that as an illustration to how we should all turn to Marx, or we will all turn to Marx in our final days, which is obviously good. Marx was a great thinker for sure. And he gives us a lot in how we can understand this situation. But given the things I've said, and I'm sure I annoyed a lot of you, I am very skeptical about this project, partly because this book, I think, I don't know for sure, but I feel like some publishers were like, hey, you want to make a lot of money? Just write this thing and then it'll be good to go. I mean, he didn't see any problem making a bunch of money debating that charlatan as a big spectacular thing against everything political correctness, which was a big joke and made me lose all credibility, or I never had credibility, lose all respect, any little I had for Žižek in that moment. But yeah, so that's what we have here. Despite me being unfair, I think Žižek has a lot of good points, and I'd like to hear what anyone else has to say. If you like what I did here, you know, you can like it. If you didn't, you can dislike it. I don't care. You can leave a comment. I have been trying to keep up with responding to comments, but there's so many of them that it's hard for me to. I delete comments that are violent or racist or homophobic or sexist. So that's just putting that out there. But yeah, I'd love to hear anything that you might have to say about this. If there's just more to Žižek in one of his other texts that could give this a little bit more steam than I'm reading in it. But in any case, yeah, catch you next time.